Hey, welcome to the Zoot Podcast. This is Chance filling in for Jordan this evening, and I'm speaking with Matt Wilson. How you doing tonight, Matt?
Good. How are you, Chance?
Good, good. We're going to be talking about your project. In the meantime, though, before we get into that, if you're listening to us on any platform right now, be sure to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, YouTube. You can catch this show this time every week, 6 p.m. Pacific time. Uh, w- we'll be discussing various projects with whoever has a campaign going on presently. In the meantime, you can check out zoop.gg to explore the different campaigns that are in the works right now, and to support those, and to help get these things funded and help these artists get their projects off the ground. So in the meantime, you might see the QR code up there in the corner where you can go directly to Matt's campaign and support him and get him to his goals so we can get this thing funded and off the ground as well. So let's start with Matt. What tell us about your project? This is the Imposter Syndicate. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So this is a comic I have had the idea for a really long time. It's something I've been trying to get made since around 2003, when I originally had the idea for it as a pitch to Marvel's Epic line, which they relaunched in 2003. That's why I know I've had this idea for that long.
Okay. I
And
never line.
what was that?
I never heard of the Epic line. That doesn't ring a bell.
Well, so you wouldn't remember the 2003 version for much. The Epic line originally in the late 70s, early 80s was how Marvel published graphic novels and some kind of other books that weren't uh, necessarily comics code friendly, or they could publish like slightly more mature content
I
through
see.
the Epic label. It was kind of Vertigo before Vertigo.
Right,
And
right.
then that label went away. And in 2003, in the last issue of Marvel, then publisher Bill Jemas introduced Epic, and the idea of Epic, that version of Epic, was they were going to take pitches from anybody, like totally open submissions.
Interesting.
And so, I read that and I said, I got a pitch. I got an idea. And
Yeah.
I was, 19, and I sent off this idea essentially, but with some Marvel characters in it. And, they rejected it. And I think there were only 3 books that ever published from the Epic line. Uh, there was a Crimson Dynamo book, there was Trouble, and there was one other one. But anyway, they rejected that, of course. And but I was really like attached to the idea, so I reworked it into a non-Marvel book with kind of like analog or parody characters.
Okay.
And the idea from the start has always been, when you see supervillains in comics or TV cartoons, a lot of times they'll be their one story will end with them seeming to die. They'll go over a waterfall, or
Yeah.
fall down a sewer, or be in a crashing blimp or something like that, and
Right.
it'll seem like, they died. They may not find a body, but by all appearances, that
They're
character, they're defeated. They're gone.
right.
And then however many months later or a year later, they just come back. They're just back, with no explanation as to how they survived that last thing.
Cobra Commander, I think, would be a good example of that.
Yeah, exactly.
Better from the old cartoon.
Yeah, I think there's an episode of Batman the Animated Series where the Joker literally is in a crash flaming blimp, and it's and then he just comes back, and
Yeah, he's
so
like herpes, he just keeps coming back. You think he's gone.
exactly, and so the idea of imposter syndicate is, what if the person who comes back, the person who returns, is not that original villain who maybe really did die, but an actor who's been hired to take their place.
Interesting.
So when the supervillains die or retire, or for whatever other reason they can't keep doing the job of being a supervillain, a shadowy, faceless organization finds an actor who is maybe down on their luck and hires them to take over the job of the new version of this villain. But by all appearances, they're the same person.
Okay.
So that's the idea of the book. And so in the first issue, our lead character, whose name is John, uh, gets hired to take over the role of like a C-list supervillain named the Bonobo.
Well, and so does John. He aware? Well, and don't spoil too much or anything. But is there like an awareness of like this is kind of the hazard of the job that you're getting into, that you're basically filling the role of a supervillain, and there's going to be some possible consequences with that.
Yeah, I mean, he knows that much. Because in the world of the book, supervillains and superheroes are real. They they're they're out in the streets fighting each other every day. But they're also like the biggest entertainment business in the world.
Okay.
So
Right.
so John has been spending the last, several months just portraying a supervillain at kids' birthday parties. Like that's his job lately. Even though, before that he had been doing, theater and maybe slightly more higher profile tasks. So he knows at least kind of generally what the deal is, but he's never been aware of the quote unquote real supervillains being hired
Okay.
hired help, so to
I really.
speak. So he wasn't aware of that part, but I think he knows the risks that come with it. So he certainly has some questions about, well, won't I get arrested? What about, you know, if I get really injured, all of that kind of stuff.
Do I have
Uh,
benefits? Is there an insurance plan or?
yeah, yeah, yeah. It's he's very hesitant at first, and it takes some convincing to get him to ultimately sign on the dotted line.
Okay. So we talked about what, sort of, going back to 2003 when you originally were trying to get this project off the ground. But what overall, kind of like over the years, what's inspired you to pursue this project and write this project?
Well, it's been an idea that I just haven't ever been able to get out of my head. I've moved on to other projects. I've done other comics. I've written other books, even other books about supervillains. And this one concept has just like never gotten out of there. Like I've always been a huge fan of the superhero satire. I think that is a era that's a um there's still stuff to mine from that part of
Mhm.
the genre. Like I was the biggest fan of the Tick, and I love the kind of like over the top characters that really played on different superhero and supervillain archetypes in that
Yeah,
comic and on that show.
absolutely. Yeah.
And so the Tick, I would say, is one of my key inspirations for this. And I just their character ideas I just can't let go or get rid of. And so And I just also love the concept of, like, you know, actors replacing supervillains and keeping the system going. Like,
Yeah.
somebody's really interested in keeping superheroes and supervillains fighting, for as long as they can.
And to me, that I think that that's like that's a draw for me. Like, I think that the initial concept that you described of these, super villains who keep coming back and being replaced with actors, that's very interesting. But more than that, like, I would want to know, like, why? Like, why is this
Yeah.
such a important? What's going on in the background? Who's pulling the strings with that? And that's very alluring to me, and the reason I would want to read this story. Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, that's the big question, that the book, if I'm lucky enough to finish the full story, uh, that's ultimately what I think is, the big question, that I would be looking to answer, by the end of John's part of it,
Well,
because
sorry. Go ahead.
no, you go ahead.
So, assuming that you did continue on with this story, what would you like to see? I mean, do you have plans to continue on, or and what kind of future plans would you envision having?
I
Again, without,
definitely
you know,
I definitely have plans to do more. These first 2 issues that I'm funding right now, uh, are in many ways just kind of the tip of the iceberg, the introduction. Like, the first issue introduces John, and then the second issue really branches out into more characters and more of the world. So I think John's story about getting into the job and then kind of discovering what it really is about, and who's pulling the strings, could be, 12, 20 issues. I think it's got a pretty defined endpoint. I think once
mhm,
John finds out who has hired him, who's his his shady employer is, that's the end of John's story. But then I think,
okay,
there's a world there that could be explored way, way more. Um,
absolutely,
so, yeah, in my head, kind of what I've got plotted out at this point is just the story of the bonobo. But there are characters introduced in issue 2 that I could do probably an entire series about, because they're funny and interesting enough that I think I could really mine them for
mhm,
some good story
yeah.
stuff.
Like, what comes to mind to me is, and maybe this might all already be something that you've explored, but like, what are some of the character traits that drive some of these people to these actors to wanna take on this task? Like, is
Yeah.
it a vanity? Are they vain? Are they desperate? Or, what kinda insecurities do they have? That sort of thing. Like, yeah, I think that there's a lot to be explored in mind from that, definitely. Um, do you mind if we take a look at some art or some pages here?
No, I don't mind that
Alright,
one
let's
bit.
take okay, and it's, Rodrigo Vargas is your artist, right?
Yeah, Rodrigo is incredible. We've worked on a project together before this, the miniseries "Everything Will Be Okay," which is kind of a, disaster kinda comic, but this being a superhero book, it's just he's outshone himself with this. I feel like it's really gorgeous, and, I think his art, alone is a reason to pick this up. It's really, really great.
Mhm. Yeah, it is really cool. And how did you said that you guys had worked together previously.
Yeah.
Um, w how did you connect at that point?
We connected maybe 5 or 6 years ago. He was a listener to, the comics podcast that I do, called War Rocket Ajax. which Chris Sims and I host weekly. And he just kind of emailed me out of the blue, because at the time for our Patreon, we were doing kind of original art commissions, uh, sort of digital pinups to send to our Patreon supporters once a month. And he just sort of emailed and said, "Hey, if you're ever interested in me doing any art for you, I'd like to get my art out there some more." And I said, "That's great. How about if we worked on a comic together?" And that's how we got together to do Everything Will Be Okay. And as soon as we were done with Everything Will Be Okay, I pitched him this book because it's one I'd been trying to get off the ground for, like I said, at the time it had been 15 years probably. Uh, because I had, over that time, I tried to connect with artists and make it happen, and just different circumstances got in the way.
Mm-hmm.
Either time got away from us, or I couldn't get together the money to pay for page rates or whatever.
Sure.
And so uh, now that there's something like Zoop, uh, I could actually make sure that Rodrigo gets paid what he deserves for that amazing art, and
Sure.
and make the book happen at the same time. So it
Yeah.
seemed like the right time to finally make it happen.
Sure. Yeah, it's kind of funny how the stars will kind of just align like that.
Yeah.
And I should have mentioned too, if folks want to interact with the chat, and chat live with us, just comment on any of the platforms that I mentioned before, and it'll show up here. So Benjamin Morse who mentioned art and colors are amazing here. So gives props to Rodrigo as well. So very cool. So you'd mentioned um, being able to fund this project properly with the help of Zoop. What has been your experience with crowdfunding? It sounds like it's been pretty good so far. Can you speak on that and how that's worked out for you?
Yeah, this is my third comics crowdfunding project. Um, I also crowdfunded a podcast related project a few years ago, but this is the third for comics. The first one was just a collection of a comic that had already been published. And then the second one was our self published version of Everything Will Be Okay before it got picked up by Caliber Comics. And both of those first two comics projects were Kickstarters, and they were successful, and I'm proud of it and proud of them and proud of how they turned out. But after each one, I kind of needed some downtime
Mm,
afterward, because there's just so much uh, work as the person running running the pod project
sure.
that's
Right.
there. Like, I'm the writer of the book. I'm also kind of the editor of the book. I'm pulling together the creative team and making sure uh, we hit various deadlines. And I'm also customer service and shipping manager and warehouse. All the books are in my office here, sitting in boxes and all of that. And so it can be a lot to do all those jobs. Uh, and, Zoop having some options to sort of help handle some of those various jobs that aren't just the creative part, uh, was and is very appealing to me. So, uh, I thought it would help me out a lot to work with Zoop on this one, to help me focus a little more on just the creative, which is the part I really, really wanna do.
Yeah, and that's so good to hear for independent artists and artists creating independent projects like that. That's really great. So you mentioned your podcast previously, and I think a dead giveaway is your audio is really good, and you've got really some good equipment there. I see. So, um, War Rocket Ajax, is that right?
Yeah, that's the comics podcast. It goes up every Monday at
Okay.
noon Eastern, and I do a few more too. Another one with Chris is called Movie Fighters. That's a really original idea for a podcast where we watch a movie and talk about it for a while. And then within Movie Fighters, we do like a snacks review show. And then I
Okay.
also do a podcast with Benito Cereno and Erica Henderson, who is the artist of the alternate cover of Imposter Syndicate.
Oh,
Uh,
cool.
about the Chucky TV show. We talk about every episode of the Chucky TV show on that show. That's
Cool.
that's called Friends Till the End.
How many seasons are they into that?
Just two. We're between seasons 2 and 3.
Okay.
So in between seasons we watch a movie every month that's kind of sort of Chucky related. Uh,
Okay.
we just did Megan. We just did a Megan episode.
I want to see that. It
Yeah.
looks like it's been pretty well reviewed. I was actually just listening this afternoon. I was listening to a movie review podcast about the Leprechaun. So kind of in that same vein. So
Yeah.
yeah. So what got you into comics as a just a comics fan and a
Yeah.
creator yourself?
I've been a comics fan as long as I can read, I think. I kinda got into it because of my brother. My brother was a big time collector. He was kind of part of the collector's market of the late '80s and early '90s.
Hmm.
So he was buying a lot of the kinda, big number ones and big milestone issues of the time. He was buying, like, a lot of X-Men number 1 and Spider-Man number 1 and,
Death of
uh,
Super.
Death of Superman, Nightfall, like, all the big event stuff, and then
Right.
kinda like the early Image comics too. And because he was into comics and he would go to our local comic shop, I would go with him and kinda just buy random issues. Like, I don't think I collected a full story arc until much later, until I was in my teens, my mid-teens probably. But I really wanted to, just buy issues that I thought looked cool and had cool characters in them. And, I ended up getting, you know, comics as gifts from my parents, and, I was just kinda really immersed in them when I was really young, and then I took a break from them for a few years because I didn't have any way to buy them anymore.
Mm.
Because my brother is a good bit older than me, and so he went off to college when I was, 11 or 12, and so I spent a few years not having a way to buy comics, and then when I got back into my mid-teens, I could actually go to the comic shop myself, and I started buying, you know, whole runs. And that's when I started noticing writers' names and creators' names, and realized which comic book writers I really liked and whose stories I really clicked with. And I think it was at that point that I started to think, "Oh, I could be I could do that. I could do the comic writing part." Because I had tried to draw my own comics when I was really young, and I thought drawing could be something I could do, but I quickly got surpassed by other kids my age, and and ended up settling on the writing part being what I wanted to do. So, yeah, I think the love of comics came really early, and the idea that I could write them uh, came once I sort of dipped back into them in my mid-teens.
Yeah. So, and what were some of those artists that influenced you and stuck out to you the most?
The writers who I remember really,
Writers, yeah.
yeah, I mean, I took note of artists too, for sure. but I sort of really clicked with certain writers who I was like, "Oh, I see, like, their methods of storytelling, their dialogue, the way they build a scene is what I would like to do too." So, like, Mark Waid and Kurt Busiek were 2 big ones. I got really into the Heroes Return books. So, after Heroes Reborn, when, the Avengers and Fantastic Four came back and had their, like, relaunched books,
Hmm.
like the Mark Waid Captain America run and Kurt Busiek on both Iron Man and Avengers. I was really, really into those. And then at some point, I think after reading some Wizard magazine, I got into Grant Morrison's JLA. And uh, I, if I had to name three from that time period, from that kind of like late 90s time period, those are the really big ones. Oh, also JM DeMatteis had my favorite Spider-Man run when he was doing Spectacular Spider-Man at the time. So all of those, like, I really clicked with and kind of got the sense of I'd like to do that.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's really
Yeah.
cool to hear. We're probably about the same age then because it was around that same time period too. I was really getting into a lot of that same stuff. So, and at that time I was like, man, nobody reads comics. I must be the only one that reads comics. So,
Yeah.
yeah. So, from somewhere else, outside of Colorado where I was, we were kindred spirits in some way. And so,
Yeah,
well,
it's
cool.
weird having been through the boom period of the early 90s. Once you got to the late 90s, you were kind of in the bust period
Yeah.
where it felt like it was not the cool thing to do, but it's when I got the most into it and was
Me
the
too.
most invested. Yeah.
Yeah, no, and I totally agree with you, and like a lot of people are really hard on that time period, like with the art or whatever. And I when I look back at that, I have a lot of nostalgia for it because that's like when I was getting into it the most, and maybe it was, as a kid, more naive that you have you're not as critical maybe, but um, yeah, that was pretty important to me for sure, and I'm glad it definitely stuck, but yeah, well, and you mentioned too about like as as soon as you were able to read, you were reading comics, and I think that is just a testament too of like a medium that maybe doesn't get the credit that's due to it. That if kids are reading, it doesn't matter what they're reading, and maybe comics don't get the sort of accolades they deserve as like uh, a medium that's good for developing and learning and that sort of thing. So yeah.
Yeah, I remember having issues of, like, Suicide Squad that I probably shouldn't have had when I was 6, but I would just reread and reread that one issue to try to understand it and
Yeah.
try to know who all the characters were and like, kinda get the nuances of it because that was a really nuanced comic book, and I was a very small child trying to grasp it all who just
Mhm.
liked, you know, the Christopher Reeve Superman movies. So,
Yep.
uh, it made me kinda dig deep into stories to try to really understand them.
Well, and I mean, and then that too, like developing critical thinking
Yeah.
and that's huge. And I also think that our age was kind of at an advantage because we had sort of those big tent pole like the Superman and then Burton's Batman and stuff. So we had kind of like those really big inspirations that kind of made you gravitate to stuff like Suicide Squad or other anything really superhero related. And that was kind of like our gateway drug, I think, and animated stuff on TV as well. So
Yeah.
I think we were like the perfect age for all that. Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there were definite milestones of, like, if I felt myself drifting away from comics or those kinds of characters, something would pull me back in, like,
Hmm.
Batman the Animated Series was a huge one for me, but I also loved the X-Men and Spider-Man cartoons too. I I got into it all.
Hmm. Absolutely. Well, and I always remember thinking too, like the comics, like the cartoons and the movies, kind of gave you like a little bit of a just a taste of it. But when you got into the comics, you had this privilege of being able to dig so much deeper into these characters and,
Yeah.
like you said, nuances. And yeah, absolutely. So we can agree that it's a comics are great.
Yes, I think we can, definitely agree on that.
Cool. All right. Well, let's definitely actually looking at your campaign page here. Looks like you're at 7,200 um, out of $6,000 that you were looking to raise. So that's pretty good news.
Yeah, we're on the way to our first stretch goal,
That's
which is
awesome.
8,000. So,
Right.
uh, ch
Right.
all everything is pushing toward that now. It would be very cool to get there.
Awesome. Yeah, absolutely. And I'm really looking forward to reading this as well. So head over to zoop.gg. Like I said, the QR code is up there in the corner, and help Matt reach this goal, and get his project funded. And again, follow us on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, also on YouTube. Stay tuned for every episode Wednesday at 6 o'clock. You can also find previous episodes on iTunes and Spotify, as well as the older live episodes live on YouTube and Facebook as well. So thanks again, Matt.
Thank
Good
you.
luck. Yeah. And we will catch you next week.